Hello, world. Welcome to another episode of the Deep Dive with Eyal Shai. My guest today is Christophe Porot. Hi, Christophe.
Hello. Howdy.
It's so good to have you here. And I'm really excited to learn from you what's an idea that has been helping you live well.
All right. Should I jump into that right away?
Yes, let's do it.
Let's do it. Well, I'm going to give a sort of poetic response to that synthesizes a few quotations that have been crucial to my understanding of this idea. But ultimately, I will be expressing a singular idea. And it begins with Nietzsche, who said that you must burn in your own flame, because if you never became ashes, how could you rise again? And I find something about this character of the rising phoenix absolutely sublime. And this idea that we burned the ashes and then come out again on top is something which speaks to my core and which has been something I've adopted throughout my life. And I've adopted it in two senses. The first is this: Charles Sanders Peirce said that just as we say that bodies are in motion and not that motion is in bodies, so too we ought to say that we are in thought and not that thoughts are in us. In other words, thoughts are a kind of home we inhabit. They are a place we dwell. They possess us, we do not possess them. So Descartes was onto something when he said we were thinking beings, because ultimately most people give their life over to one singular ideology or one trauma-based consideration or one thought which governs every decision they ever make, whether it be capitalism or theology or something else. And I seek foundationally a liberty, that sense of transcendence which comes with being able to move between thoughts. So what I've done is I've tested experimentally in the lab of life what it's like to believe in different things and how those different belief structures affect my ability to be a rising phoenix. I'm somebody who spent 3 years in a mental hospital, so I know what it's like to be down and out. And I've come back. I've made my rise again. I'm now doing my doctoral studies in philosophy. I'm extremely proud of that. And I think that ultimately, this way that I consider the stream of considerations that I've just outlined is very simple. We are the dancers of this world. We are the choreographer. We are the dancer. It is our show. It is our time to perform. Nobody can take away the stage. And we have to do what we can to make it a beautiful performance. We will have moments where we're down and out, but that's when you're burning to ashes. And that in itself is a beautiful thing. So I think that Nietzsche line, elaborated in the context of liberty understood as intellectual liberty, has guided me powerfully throughout my days and is a thought which has shaped my life immensely.
Yeah, man. Well, thanks for sharing, and yeah, welcome, fellow Phoenix, because I myself have elaborated before um, on this podcast about my connection to the myth of the phoenix and that figure. And actually, I read Nietzsche, so it only makes sense that at some point I picked up on this line, but I completely forgot it. And so, really, thank you for connecting it and relating it again, because this kind of adds to my whole thing with the phoenix. But I absolutely love it, and a big believer that in what you say about how we are eventually the people who are performing here, and what we should do should be for our own sake, and we should be the enjoyers of this, and we should be the ones responsible for this, and we should be the ones who um, also, yeah, rise when things don't go our way. um, yeah, I'm interested to hear maybe a little bit about of your backstory with the struggles, because it does sound like, for me, the myth of the phoenix definitely came to me as something to hold on to for yeah um a type of strengthening thing, right? A support system for me, because I was struggling with depression in my case, and just understanding that if I go through the hardest thing of my life, if I got burned to ashes and I rise again, if I do it once, I can do it many times. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
interested to hear from you when, maybe if you remember, when was the first time where this actually became explicit in your mind, something about turning to ashes and rising from ashes?
Ooh, that's a great question. Let me give you, because you were asking about a bit of a backdrop to the context of rising from the ashes. So why don't I give you a little bit of the scenario in which there's really two peaks and two falls. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, sure.
So basically, I'm very transparent about my life with everybody, but I also like to give a warning that it's a somewhat dark story at the origin, even though it flowers and blooms wonderfully by the end. And the dark origin is this: look, when I was young, I was unfortunately a victim of forced sex as a child, and this controlled my emotional life to a significant degree, to a point where I was discarded as somebody who was merely irrelevant while I was in school, somebody who was predestined to go to prison, somebody who had no chance at acquiring academic or other types of success. And this caricature of who I was going to become intimidated me to a degree that was so real for me that I underperformed and I could never achieve my own potential all the way out through the end of high school. And then, right after high school, I was just good enough to go to college, a small liberal arts college in Minnesota. And right after, within my first 2 years there, my mother died. And the death of my mother actually incited in me an incredible fury of ambition, because I wanted to prove that she was always right, that everybody who doubted me was wrong, and that her dreams, which were almost uniquely about what her children could become by the time she died, because she had forfeited her own dreams when she knew that she was facing the end, would be realized. She would never have to, lose sleep or lose rest over the idea that her son was unable to achieve the goals that he had for himself. So I rose. That was my first time rising from the ashes, is actually the death of my mother, which was so disturbing that my own version of denial compelled me into great success. I ended up going to Oxford to study philosophy, and then I went to Harvard after that, where I spent 1 year in the philosophy department. Then I went over to the divinity school, acquiring the dean's fellowship along the way. And that was the peak. That was the I've achieved the dreams my mother thought I had for myself. And then, because I achieved it, the denial ended. And I broke to a
Hmm.
point that was so catastrophic. I went into a depression so bleak. All my trauma and the trauma of losing my mother controlled every single element of every breath of my life, to a point where I lived in nothing but fear. I had tremendous weight gain. I had tremendous inability to cope. And I ended, this burst into a manic episode, because in my amateur theory is that mania is essentially an attempt to resolve depression by releasing all the dopamine at once, which leads to
Hmm.
euphoric experiences. And what's hilarious about it is, while depressed, I was as delusional as it gets. But nobody would acknowledge that, because they said, oh, yeah, you hate yourself, or you think you're not important unless you achieve great things, or you think that you're unworthy. But we all think that. The moment I became manic and I thought, no, I'm the greatest thing there ever was, everybody's like, well, now you've got a problem. So there's something characteristic about the delusions of depression, which
Huh.
are culturally acceptable, while the delusions of mania are rejected. And because I turned into somebody who had a manic episode, I was involuntarily hospitalized by way of police force taking me in Los Angeles. The LAPD, they pulled their guns out and everything. It was not a fun experience. And after a few hospitalizations in the US, which were definitively unenjoyable, I got on a plane during a manic episode. I went to Asia, and I was in Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia, where I was hospitalized again in Indonesia. There, it's kind of considered a human rights crisis, the way they treat mental health patients in Indonesia.
Right.
They chain you up, they tie you to beds, they punch you, they choke you out. They did all of this to me as well. And eventually, through a lot of diplomatic work, literally diplomats getting involved, there was an arrangement made, because I'd given away my passports, where I could go to France, but the French government was unwilling to release me from the hospital for 2.5 years, till they were sure that there would be no more episodes and that I was stabilized. And after that time of dwelling within an institutional life, there were a lot of folks who gave up on the possibility that I could make a comeback. And I'm one of the only people who didn't. In fact, I read so much philosophy and I wrote so much, I even published some papers while I was in the hospital, that I knew I would be making a comeback. And so the second time that I rose from the ashes was in the past year, when I started my doctorate at the Sorbonne, when I continued onward to keep publishing, to keep working as I work, to do what I love doing, and to know that I've got a future in the very activity that brings me the deepest joy. So I've risen from the ashes twice. First, has a form of denial that my mother was actually gone, like her dreams lived on through me. And then once I felt
Hmm.
I'd actualized those dreams enough, confronting the reality of her departure, the great darkness that overcame me, and rising again from that. Those are my two Phoenix moments. And if I have to have a third, so be it. The trio will come.
Yeah, I love hearing that, and honestly, you've just yeah, told such a story with so many details that it's kind of hard to decide what to pick at first.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say, for me, I see myself as having gone through one of these cycles because I haven't had a second kind of spectacular fall at any point. But I think we share the perspective, and you know, to be sure, I'm very proud of you. Like I haven't gone through anything quite like that at all. It's so that is just amazing to hear, and I'm really happy to see you doing well right now. Um, and yeah, I really like the fact that if there is a third time, then so be it. This is the attitude that really fascinates me because it's so liberating. It's so
It
liberating,
is.
right? How many of us are so afraid of the fall? um just now I'm reading about Sam Bankman-Fried with FTX or something, which is definitely he's having his uh falling into ashes moment. And but anything like that, and most people I think would look at something like that and it's like, oh, he lost his whole world or everything he knew or everything he thought he had. And this is terrifying to most people. I think this is what
Mm-hmm.
motivates people to actually stay mediocre and play it safe and go through a life trajectory that doesn't include bold moves or entrepreneurial um, endeavors or something like that. So yeah, I
It
will
feels.
ask a question to end with
Mhm.
that. I heard I saw Stephen Fry documentary about bipolar disorder because he suffers from it. And
Mhm.
whether to call it a sufferer, I don't know. That's, I guess, up to anyone. I don't know what you call it. But people who
Afflicted
have
seems
been
like an
diagnosed.
appropriate term.
Hmm.
Afflicted seems like a fair term. It's a kind of
Afflicted.
affliction, you know.
Okay. And so he made a fantastic documentary about it. And he went and asked famous people and just other people if they would ever actually give up both the downs of depression and the ups of mania. And I thought the very interesting part was that all of them said, no, I would not give up this even if I could. And yeah, I'm really interested in hearing from you what your feeling about this is.
Great. Well, let me comment on a few things because you said a lot of beautiful things and it was very
Yeah.
enjoyable and entertaining to hear them. But one of the things you said is, don't worry, I'll ask a question or something to that effect. And I know that you will get to a question, but also it's okay with me if we have a questionless conversation. You know, sometimes
Yeah,
there's so much enthusiasm to talk that people just take turns riffing off of each other's points. And there's absolutely no shame in that. Not everything has to be governed by a question, even a
absolutely.
podcast. So you are free to just comment, and I'll always have a response comment. It's who I am, it's what I do. So feel comfortable asking or not asking questions. Just know that
Sure,
we're in the
I'm happy with that. Yeah, whatever flows flows.
whatever flows flows. We got a great harmony between us, and I'm happy to explore it, whether it be directed by questions or by enthusiastic responses to each other. So
Yeah.
then the second thing is, you had asked, you'd mentioned the highs and lows and how so few people, none at all, in fact, would give those up. I would give those up. And I think that's one of the reasons why I have sustained a stability for so long. I'm willing to sacrifice extreme highs and extreme lows
Hmm.
and have, like, within a range, highs and lows, because I find there are pleasures in life deeper than emotions. There's an emotional quality to it, but fundamentally, the element of intellectual life, of philosophical life, transcends whatever given emotion you're enduring in the moment, and it brings you into a space within your heart, within your soul, that is so rewarding that it doesn't rely on highs and lows to bring meaning to the experience. It rather relies on the consistent ability to to exact concentrated effort over a singular subject, which ultimately means that you have the inner discipline to go ahead, read 4 or 5 hours a day, write 2 or 3 hours a day, think as you walk, think as you run, think as you work out, think as you live, have beautiful conversations, and live an entire life decorated by ideas. This is what I believe in. This is why there's an element to me that's so Cartesian, because everybody critiques Descartes for overemphasizing the role of thinking. And they say, well, when we let go of thinking, that's when we heal. What does that even mean? As though absence is not a type of thought, as though an emptiness is not a type of thought. That is a clearing.
Mm-hmm.
That is a type of thought, a sort of openness. So it's impossible for me to imagine what it means to escape thinking. And when you really get to the definitive quality of what we are an assemblage of thoughts, and those control us. And Ibn Sina said thoughts have the power to bring you recovery or illness. And there's something absolutely true about this. I'll give you one last example, because we've had a very open discussion about the role of trauma in life and everything else. I recently, in a very therapeutic setting, confronted what it meant for me to succeed without my mother being around, and it opened a million doors for me. I all of a sudden started working out again. I started running, walking abundantly, doing circuit workouts twice a day. I'm still in progress, but I'm getting there. I all of a sudden was able to go ahead and finish my filing to do the doctorate. I was able to allow myself to succeed because there was a thought blocking my physical movement. There was a thought blocking my intellectual movement. There was a thought blocking my material success. So it is absurd to me that somebody would privilege anything above the quality of their thinking. And if destabilization undermines good thinking, that's a strong enough reason to say, look, I don't want the highs and lows. I want, however boring it is, what Epicurus called ataraxia, which is relief from suffering. It's not the presence of a euphoria, and it's not the presence of a pain. It's the absence of pain that doesn't invoke necessarily a euphoric or happy state. But that is the
Yeah.
ultimate pleasure for Epicurus and for me
Well,
as well.
literally, it's being without confusion, so unperturbed. Yeah, and I really like that too.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
So that's my long-winded response to your question. And I'm not even sure if I answered your question. I just gave you a response.
No, yeah, man, you have. Like you said, it's well, yeah. Who cares what the question was, right? But I mean, it's. I really relate with that because I think that in recent years, and it's not to say anything anti something else, but I love it that it's really kind of pulling and therefore widening the whole scope of people looking. I think that working with your intellect and just like spewing more and more and more words about something can be confusing. It can be used to subvert logic and can be really unhelpful. And I think that a lot of people have realized that, and a lot of people are talking today about, maybe let's go a lot more in the direction of the body, listen to the body, and be holistic in that regard. And it's true, like it's all true and good, but I'm really happy that you're bringing up thought again, and yes, and intellectualism, without shame, because I feel like it's a whole area that has been kind of criticized very heavily in recent years, at least. And I can see why, but I completely agree that there is a type of thinking which is thinking well, which I don't think a lot of people actually practice. And I really like how you reframe the things to maybe say that, being in a state of a state that you get to through meditation or something where your mind is seemingly empty of concepts, well, that is also a thought. Like, let's not deny that. And I like it because ultimately it kind of really, as I said, it just really broadens the spectrum of things and make a lot of things possible. And yeah, I absolutely agree that about the highs and lows and the absence of them. I mean, personally, like I said, I've never been diagnosed. Don't think I am bipolar in any way. Um, but I have noticed throughout my life a tendency to always seek stability and sustainability. And it's interesting because in our culture, it's so boring. It's almost something that is just like, ugh, just kill me before,
Hmm.
my life becomes boring. And it's really interesting because people, in the name of seeking a lot of novel um, adventures to tell about, to talk about, or to experience, the way I see it, they resign to um, leading lives which are actually quite unchanging and are quite boring, to be honest. And they never actually enrich themselves spiritually and intellectually, as you say, which I think is actually something that's scarce. And so I really like you bringing it up because I've been trying to think for myself. I've gotten to a point in life where sometimes it almost freaks me out, the fact that I can just close my eyes and really just basically it's something close to hallucination. Like I can almost
Yeah,
hallucinate just shapes and colors moving around and just be quite happy with the light show that's going on. um
that
and,
fascinates me.
and I really like it. I really like it. And it makes me realize that I don't need to do a base jump or anything extreme outside of myself, and I'm really happy with that in a way. And my life on the surface is not that interesting. I just went to Portugal, but I went for years without going abroad, not doing anything particularly spectacular or anything like that, because I've imported a lot of that into my own mind.
Yeah. Well, because I really like what you said. So let me break down my response into three discrete and quick parts. The first is a commentary on the very condition of living a ostensibly boring life, independent of how rich your inner life is. And I think Flaubert has the best words to capture what that ultimately amounts to. Flaubert has a quote where he says something to the effect of this: be boring and unoriginal in your life so that you can be wild and violent in your work. And this I've strongly subscribed to. My philosophical labor is wild and violent. It's what I do, it's characteristic of who I am. I go after everybody and everything that I see a problem with. I don't hesitate. And it looks like I'm just hanging out on a computer or going for a nice walk in Burgundy or whatever I'm doing. But actually, I'm living a rich, violent inner life that is amazing. And so the stability that anchors all of it is essential to enabling a certain kind of wilderness. And so once you let that wilderness speak, you discover that something fantastic exists, which doesn't require you to drink Red Bull, jump off cliffs, expose yourself to high risk situations, or anything of this nature. You yourself are perpetually living on the razor's edge between life and death. And as somebody who's been through depression, you know that how real that is. You are always on the edge of life and death. One day
Yes.
it will eventually tilt in the other direction, but every day it's a renewed life. So go ahead and appreciate that as much as possible. That's my first comment. My second comment is on the elaborate, annoying, and very popular critiques of thinking. A lot of it is meditation based, even though they, in a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists, will divorce meditation from its metaphysics, which I find to be problematic. But nonetheless, they'll say things like, well, if you just imagine your thoughts flowing by you like logs on a river, or if you just remember you are not your thoughts, and all these things. This is obviously a thought. So my meta-analysis is just to acknowledge how absurdly amateur this philosophical reverie is around the anti-thinking process. And what it encourages, I think, is a kind of anti-intellectualism that honestly has caused more harm than good, and I would even contend might be related to the rise of the Donald Trumps of this world, because there are so many people who say, well, thinking is problematic, so not thinking is the answer. Well, then you got your answer. Trump doesn't think, and I don't want to say too much about politics, but I'm veering in that direction only for a moment to give a what I consider an obvious example of somebody who doesn't think, regardless of what you think of him. He just goes with the flow. He is has zen as it can be in that sense.
Right.
So uh, there is this going with the flow, discouraging yourself from thinking. All of that seems to radically challenge what is the beautiful development of life that so many philosophers, poets, hard workers of the mind have cultivated for so long. And with such a rich and vast literature available to us, it is a tragedy that we ignore it for the sake of watching our thoughts flow by like logs on the river, because you can do both. You can acknowledge that distancing yourself from your more immediate thoughts is a way of creating an opening for your more profound thoughts without subscribing to the idea that whatever given thought bubbles up in your consciousness is the most important thing in the world. So there's that. Then,
Mm-hmm.
the third thing that I wanted to respond to was very, very simple. And I wanted to say this. You are right that there is a danger to thinking. There is a danger to it. But, I consider it in the same way I consider solitude. It's a sword that cuts the fat around your emotions so that you're left raw in either bliss or misery. And that's what it's going to give you, bliss or misery. It almost never gives you the in-between. And by bliss, I have something that's stable in mind, but nonetheless, I qualify it as a type of bliss, this rich inner life. Or
Mm-hmm.
it'll bring you into the darkness because you'll ruminate on negative things perpetually. So you're right, not all thinking is good, but thinking, as dangerous as it can be, like so many other dangerous things, has an upswing to it. It has a liberating factor. And I believe fundamentally that Kant was onto something when he said that to be free is to follow a law that you yourself generate. Because if you can think through what matters in your life and generate a set of laws that you yourself follow, and you're obedient only to yourself, even though there's something nihilistic about that. And Kant had his own system for how you avoid and end up everybody has kind of the same laws when they use rational faculties and whatever. I'm ignoring the rest of Kant. That part alone, that you're free when you develop a law that you yourself follow, requires you to think. You got to think about what matters. Zena Hitz, in a great book called Lost in Thought, talks about the fact that we have a hierarchy of values, without which it would be impossible to make decisions. In other words, we all value one thing more than another, and because of that, we're able to make a decision from A to B and so forth and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And most of us are blind to our hierarchy of values. But one of her justifications of the intellectual life is precisely that you can put your hierarchy of values into the forefront of your consciousness and assess whether their value is worth preserving or not. So that is my 3-part, which turned into a 4-part response to your beautiful statements.
Yeah, no, I really like it. I will say something to to hedge a bit, at least from my perspective, about meditation and integrate it into something which I think is beneficial together, because I think it's all beneficial if done right. So I think
Oh,
we
meditation is
have,
amazing. Yeah. Let me just say that
yeah,
really
yeah,
quickly so nobody gets me wrong about this.
yeah.
Meditation and prayer have very similar cognitive effects, and they are both amazing features of human existence that are very worth celebrating. And when I critique the analysis of what meditation actually is, I am not critiquing meditation itself. It's a disclaimer. Go on though,
Great.
please.
Right. No, yeah. So I want to make the point. I don't meditate regularly anymore, but at least I have a good argument for it, which is for meditation and dialectic, which is what I do, which is the art of training myself to think well,
Mm-hmm.
are um, arts that are there to help you and to make you better and eventually instill in you the habits which are good for you, which are good
Mm-hmm.
for sustaining health, which is really what ethics is all about. So ethics, literally in Greek, the um, literally just habits, or
You sound like
when
a
your
stoic to
person.
me.
Mhm.
You sound like a stoic to me.
Well, I guess in some way. But, well, literally, ethics is just
Mm-hmm.
things pertaining to personality or habits, because our personality is just the sum of our habits. And so
Mm-hmm.
the science there is what kind of habits are actually conducive to well being. That's all. That's ethics. And um, thinking is just something which we do, right? It's almost like you can't really close your ears and not hear, right? So
Mm-hmm.
trying to not do it is kind of is just doomed. And still, you can do it well or you can do it poorly. Just as with,
Undeniably.
for example, any kind of somatic work, you can be very much in tune with your body and be sensitive enough to feel if something is going wrong with your body, or you can be completely oblivious and, find out that you've been really unhealthy for years now, which also, of course, affected your mood and thinking. And
Yeah.
meditation, to me, is maybe the third part of this triad, is attention. And attention is really important because we always, by definition, pay attention to something, and there's always something which um, warrants our immediate attention.
Mm-hmm.
But we can be bad at paying attention to things which are actually conducive to well-being, and we can get carried away and pay attention to all the wrong things. And then when we have this kind of terrible situation, which a lot of people are sadly in, which is they pay attention to some small thing which is actually not a good predictor of, doesn't really have to do anything with living well. So, usually, some sort of potential catastrophe or something. And that's all they're paying attention to. And we're not thinking well about it, which results in basically very, very small closed loops of thoughts. So that becomes kind of what we call obsessive thought, or just relentless thinking. And that gets people to say, "Oh, I'm an overthinker. I really don't like
Mm-hmm.
this thing, overthinker." I mean,
Use a different word
you're
besides thinking. Yeah, you're not thinking, you're repeating. I'm an over repeater, because you're repeating the
exactly. It's
same thing
it's
over and over again.
exactly. You should be thankful that you have the capacity to think that much, but
Mm-hmm.
you probably want to be able to shift your thinking in to make your thinking more creative and to focus it on other things. So you're
Mm-hmm.
not an overthinker. You're just a person with a huge capacity for thinking, which is amazing. It's a really good starting point for living well. But you should probably learn what to focus your thinking on and make sure that you're um, thinking well. I think, and that's something that came up from your points for me.
Absolutely. So let me preface my reply to you by saying that having spent so much time in the mental health world, I'm very familiar with the concept of being triggered. And I've invented an inverse concept, which I call being uncorked, which is like being triggered in the sense that you're like a bottle of champagne that just popped open and everything's coming out, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
positive rather than a negative thing. And I think in your
Mm.
presence, I feel very uncorked. So once again, I'm going to respond to multiple parts of what you said because everything you say entertains me. And I'm actually going to call back to something you said much earlier, which really fascinates me. So, but you'll see it should blend seamlessly with the rest. The first thing about directing attention, inevitably, this becomes quite important, especially as we grow older and older and we have more and more memories to ruminate on. We have to learn how to direct our attention, either in a sense that embellishes our joy, a sense that brings us peace, or a sense that liberates us from the negativity that can control the rest of our lives. So I agree with you. Directing attention, meditative tactics are very useful for that. So too, I always tell people, is prayer. We forget that for a lot of folks, meditation is kind of a bizarre, foreign concept that they're not habituated to in their youth and that they try to adopt later on in life. And I once had a great scholar of Hinduism who I was talking with named Anantanand Rambachan, and he had given so many beautiful lectures about the Advaita tradition in Hinduism. I told him I kind of want to convert, and he said, "Well, just practice it through your own cultural familiarity because you have this disposition in your youth which shapes who you become. So if you practice things with an adjustment to what you're deeply familiar and comfortable with, you'll practice it
Mm-hmm.
even better than if you go all the way into what seems exotic to you. And so, for a lot of folks who struggle to meditate, my suggestion would be do what I do, which is independent of whether or not you believe in God, pray. Because I'll tell you, I've had experiences where, for instance, I've said this to you once before when we had a private conversation, but my great weakness is I sometimes fall in love. And when I fall in love, and we'll have great meditations on love in this conversation, I'm sure, but when I fall in love, it can be overwhelming. And so I once fell in love with somebody who had no love for me. So I wanted to be released from the experience of desiring romantic love so that I could tend to them as a good friend. So I prayed for basically 2 days straight with breaks for sleep and exercise, minus the exercise, but definitely the sleep, because this was before I got back in the gym. But I prayed for 2 days straight, and on the third day, everything felt better. All of my romantic desire washed away. I was left in peace. I became a great friend of this person, and it was a wonderful experience. So we can utilize prayer in the same way we utilize meditation. So that's one. The second thing I want to say is that you talked about ethic, and about the way it is really a reflection of personality, which is a reflection of habit. And this is like a Greek understanding where virtue ethics is so significant for the Greeks, especially Aristotle. And this is actually exactly what I'm working on my thesis about, which is, for virtue ethics, it goes all the way down. To be a loving person or a kind or a patient or a thoughtful person or something like that goes all the way down. And what I'm arguing is that the mystics, especially the Islamic mystics like Ibn Tufayl and Averroes and so forth, twisted the virtue ethic a little bit to create something I call imitatio Dei, imitation of the divine, where it doesn't have to go all the way down, but you imitate the attributes of God as a lifelong process, or you imitate them until you achieve apotheosis or assimilation with the divine, in which case, just like
Mm.
Kierkegaard's three stages, which begin with the aesthetic, the Don Juan and so forth, the man seducing
Mm-hmm.
woman or whatever, and goes to the ethical. And then after the ethical, there's the spiritual. So too, there's something like that for the Islamic mystics, where there's this imitation process of the divine, try to give yourself the divine attributes. But once it goes all the way down, you've achieved apotheosis and you're beyond ethics in a sense. So there is a long and
Wow.
beautiful history to virtue ethics that amazes and stuns me, and which I intend to speak about on December 8th at a big speech I'm giving at the Sorbonne, which I'm trying to pitch to everybody to come, because it's going to be my, just like when we opened up and I said, this is the world is our stage. That's my stage right there. And that's what I'm really excited about. Then the third thing that I wanted to bring up that flows out of the second, because I've opened the door to mysticism already, is when you talked about hallucinating on your own or something like a hallucination. We all have those, and we have them in extreme moments, especially. What fascinates me is the literature surrounding guardian angels, that people in life or death situation will say they hear a voice say, "Be calm and all will be well." But it's not a voice anybody else can hear. It's just a voice they hear, or they'll feel a presence, like somebody's with them. And this amazes me. They become mystical in extreme situations, even entirely unreligious people. And what fascinates me about that is there are really two options. It could be us taking care of ourselves, or it could be something transcendent and distinct from us. But that first option, it's us taking care of ourselves, like it's our subconscious vocalizing itself and so forth, means that hallucinations, like hearing a voice that nobody else hears, or seeing something that nobody else sees, which also happens in those extreme scenarios, can be an evolutionary advantage, which might make us rethink how we approach people who are schizophrenic and hear voices nobody else does. They have overcompensated for something which we all have. And so we put them on a continuum with the rest of humanity rather than break them apart from humanity. So this invocation of hallucinations within your personal experience is something I want to applaud you for doing. And I know it's a callback to earlier, but as I said, I've been uncorked, so I'll be calling things back and picking from random parts of the conversation with my sheer enthusiasm.
No, that's great. That's really great. Yeah, I had a really interesting night with two interesting dreams. The first, we were a group of people and we were walking out on a dead tree that somehow like leaned against something, but it was clear. It was also windy outside, so very unstable. And I was I realized that the wind is going to make me fall from the tree. So I held on and kind of embraced a woman that was in front of me from the back. She was older than I am, to protect her. And we fell together and just dropped to the ground, and we were fine because it was from very high up, so not
Mm-hmm.
realistic in that sense. But this is also interesting because, as you're going to see with the really the second part of this dream and the other dream, they were not realistic, but they were not realistic exactly in the way to give me something that is catastrophic but gets resolved in a safe and good way. So I
Mm-hmm.
managed to somehow break the fall and save her and made sure that she's fine. But then I
Mm-hmm.
saw somebody else's baby, and not my baby, and not my 4 year
Mm-hmm.
old daughter, which I'm grateful for, because I was thinking later, like, I wouldn't have been able to deal with that somehow. But I saw
Mm-hmm.
a different baby, like, falling off, like, from way up high, alone, and I knew that he was not going to survive. And the whole atmosphere with the people around me, it's just tragedy. Just was very clear
Mm-hmm.
what happened. Um, and I felt in myself that for some reason, usually I'm very good at immediately responding with whatever emotion is fitting. I did not, because it was not my baby, I did not immediately break down in tears or sadness or something like that. But I was kind of confused. And then after a few moments in the dream, it kind of dawned on me, and I started crying because this young boy had lost his life. And just as I did that, there was a kind of twist that where he was fine after all, and go figure.
Mm-hmm.
But it turned out fine. So two things. That's one dream. Two things that were not going to end well. They ended well. And then the other dream is me, my wife, and my kid. Um, just looking at a rocket that comes our way, like a
Mm-hmm.
ground to ground rocket, and fearing for our lives for a moment. And then, I realized that it was going to fall far enough away for us to come out unscathed. So the
Mm-hmm.
moment I understood this and saw the trajectory, I lost all fear because I
Yeah.
knew it wasn't going. And if you understand something, you don't fear it anymore. That's the rule. I mean, people who fear bees, right? Is like there's a bee in the room. Clearly, as you mentioned, like they're not thinking, they're not taking on, they don't have a good concept of what a bee is, because if they did, they knew that bees have no business just stinging you for no reason. So
Right.
there's no reason to fear what you understand. um,
Mm-hmm.
but anyway, these two dreams have really caused me today to think a lot about how these catastrophic events and the fact that they played out in my mind. This has to do with the fact that I watched a YouTube video about the books of Daniel and Revelations in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So both in the Old
Mm-hmm.
Testament and the New Testament, there's these what we call apocalypse literature. I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
this informed my dreams, um, but it was very interesting that this is where my mind went, to these extreme situations that, miraculously in my dream ended well. And yeah, I don't know, I feel like it connects to what you were saying. um, and I'm trying to think if it connects in any way to prayer or something like that. And I think it does, because this is where my attention went. And I really like what you say about prayer, because it is focusing, right? And if you look at transcendental meditation, where you start with a phrase and you repeat it over and over,
Mm-hmm.
we think that these things are um, very far apart, like meditation and prayer, or meditation and dialectic, which is done through speaking words. But then you learn about there is actually a meditation school, and I can't remember the name. I can't remember where I encountered it, but apparently there was a meditation school that's probably somewhere between India, which we call the East, and Greece, which we call the West, and it was probably somewhere up the area of Persia or something like that, but a meditation school where actually what went through the mind of people practicing it is actually thoughts, but at a
Hmm.
reduced pace. So
Oh, that's
they knew how
beautiful.
to pay attention to things and think things through, but very slowly on purpose.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so that's what came to my mind, and yeah, I'm sorry, it makes me digress. I'm not sure what the
Oh
whole
no, I
point
love it.
is,
I love it. So
but
let me comment.
I'm kind of at this point, I'm trusting you to kind of put
We're
it all
uncorked.
together.
We're uncorked. It's a good thing.
Yes,
So I mean, the
yes,
opening is about dreams, right? Dreams about catastrophe that turn out to be okay in the end, and what makes them okay is the question. And I have a lot of commentary on this. The first is actually you said it was bizarre that you didn't respond immediately in tears to the infant falling alone,
yeah. Or is
but
it really?
it's not at all. That's how grieving goes. The very first stage is shock, denial. You know, when my mother died, I was in such shock about it. I remember being tearless and feeling okay while they brought sandwiches and being like, oh, this is great. I get free sandwiches and people are coming over and they're giving me their condolences. I'm getting tons of attention. I guess it just doesn't feel that weird when somebody goes. And then one day I woke up and it felt like my heart had been beaten with 1,000 baseball bats for 2 months straight. And I could not walk or move. I could hardly breathe. And that's when the grieving began. So it's
Mm,
very normal that you go into shock when something truly catastrophic happens. And I think navigating the shock of this world in the midst of catastrophe is not unique to apocalyptic literature, but is actually, especially for those who care about oppression and other phenomena, a reality that defines the world we live in. And this is why somebody like Cornel West loves the blues, and I love the blues as well. But I owe this theory of the blues to him, which is, you know, the blues is not about avoiding suffering. It's about making suffering beautiful. In a way, it eases you out of shock
mm,
because you're there and you're no longer in denial, but you also see the beauty in what's going on. So managing, interpreting, healing in the midst of absolute catastrophe is so profound. And I had a dream that I'll share, which speaks to this as well, because dreams can be so beautiful. They're worth sharing. Which my
yes.
dream goes like this. I'll never forget it. I had two dreams that were really meaningful to me. Because you brought up two, I'll bring up two. But mine are less thematically connected, so the burden gets placed back on you. So, the
Great.
first dream, I was on a beach, and it was a half rocky, half sandy beach, and there were ivory dodo birds marching one by one off of a cliff into the water next to me, while giant waves were rolling in and fizzing out just before the shore. The woman of my life was before me, but I could only see her hair. I knew that she and I had been together for a long time and would be together till death do us part, but I had no idea who she was, nor did I even have an inkling of a desire to try to figure out who she was. I was merely contented that she was there. And on these waves, great philosophers, including John Rawls, were surfing to their death because the waves were crashing so sharply into the shore, even though they were fizzing out before they reached my feet. So I watched great philosophers and ivory dodo birds die simultaneous to each other, one by way of cliff, the other by way of waves. And I also had the comfort of the lover of my life being with me, who, by the way, does not exist and may never exist. So I just
Mm.
had that comfort. And I woke up and I said, what the heck was that? Because that was way too intense, right?
Yeah.
And my reflection on this dream was very simple. You know, dodo birds are extinct for a reason, they say. And maybe philosophers are sort of going extinct for a reason as well. I think philosophy is on the upswing right now, but too many philosophers have used obscure language, have used obscure techniques, have used unaccessible, undesirable patterns of thinking in order to develop a certain prestige around them that so that they're untouchable by the public. And I think that the longer philosophers do
I
that, the
will
more,
say, I will
yeah.
just interject quickly. I think that they were not, to take it back to attention, that what happens is that the archetypal philosopher today is just, as we think of it, is just somebody who's like almost completely disregarding relationship with people. And so you're able to
Yeah.
build this whole kind of life philosophy for yourself, and you write it, and then people are impressed by your rhetoric and flow in there, but um, they
But
haven't
they have
tried
no
to
idea
make
what you're
enough
saying.
contact with real people, so it becomes detached and so on. And people, I think, rightfully rejected that eventually. So I think
Hmm.
that's the cause for the kind of disdain that people have for the the archetypal philosopher, like sits at his room and doesn't actually have friends, but just yeah.
Whatever becomes overtly elitist inspires eventually a revolution against it. When you take away from the masses and give only to a select few, which philosophy has made that horrible commitment of doing that, then and it's not rewarded people who know how to speak in public settings. It's not rewarded people who convert their ideas in ways that are accessible, not to the degree that it should. So, it's definitely at risk, and it has been for a while because of that habit. And this version of philosophy, where there's a rhythm to the language, but nobody knows what you're saying, is what I call
Right.
bad poetry. It's just bad
Yes.
poetry. It's not as good as real poetry, but it's got the same quality of being beyond the immediate grasp without the delivering of stimulating somebody's own insight and their own path, because people are so confused by what you're saying, they're merely picking up on the sense that what you're saying is meaningful. And I think
Yeah, and
that's a
it's
great
sophistry. It's
tragedy.
sophistry too, because it appeals to a certain aesthetic that people developed in academia, which, if I write this and that, the content doesn't matter anymore. The form is going to get me applause from the people who appreciate this kind of form. And
Hmm.
yeah, it just gets more and more arcane and less grounded in any way, shape, or form.
And let me vivify that quickly, and then I'll tell you my second dream. Does that sound good?
Sure, yeah.
So the vivification of that was, I won't reveal who or in what field, because it would, if I revealed the field, I'd be revealing who. But I was editing somebody's paper, a very successful person, and I said, "Look, hey, this line is really beautiful, but there are three very distinct, incompatible interpretations of what it means. In other words, three implications that you have here." And they said, "Yeah, but that doesn't matter in my field. Ambiguity is fine." And I think ambiguity, if approached intentionally, if you say, look, something like the relationship between the individual and the collective is inherently ambiguous. Something like the relationship between our freedom and our constraints is inherently ambiguous. Then you can write in a way that evokes that ambiguity. But if you're writing about something which doesn't necessitate ambiguity, and you're doing it ambiguously just because you don't feel obliged to be clear, you should stop considering yourself a thinker.
Right.
You're not a thinker. You're not
Yes.
an intellectual. You're not helping anybody out. You're just doing bad poetry. And you can make the pivot to doing real poetry and put yourself through that fire, or you can make the pivot to doing real philosophy and put yourself through that fire. But this cozy little artistic moment that you're having is irrelevant to the progress of thought, in my opinion. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the dream. Are you ready for this?
Of course.
Okay, so the dream goes like this. And this is a true story, by the way. I'm in the hospital. It's one of my first nights in the hospital in France. And I know I'm going to be there for a long time. I can detect from the way that the tyranny of the psychiatrist, and I mean, psychiatrists help a lot of people, but in a clinical setting, especially when you're a patient in a hospital, they're the dictators. The nurses are their, you know, administrators, and the actual, because people forget that mental hospitals have a lot of big men that go around
Mm-hmm.
enforcing things. Like if you don't want to take your medicine, they can strap you down and put the medicine inside of you and stuff like that. So people forget that they have enforcers in mental hospitals, which is why I don't like the language about like, oh, if only the police acted like mental health specialists do. It's like, do you have any idea how mental health specialists act? They're
Right.
very violent towards the patients. So anyway, that being a side note, I'm in there. I know I'm going to be in there for a long haul, and I go to sleep, and I have a call back to uh, a lover of mine who is one of the only people I had a deep and intimate connection with in my life, holding me in a room with cotton drapes, having a breeze go through them so that they kind of danced in the breeze, candles everywhere. And it was not a romantic desire. It was somebody reassuring me that everything would be okay eventually. And within the dream, I fell asleep and I woke up within the dream. And that's kind of like Edgar Allan Poe, life is but a dream within a dream, you know. And I woke
Mm-hmm.
up within the dream. And I remember thinking to myself, thank goodness this wasn't just a dream, because I had fallen asleep and woken up. And then I woke up for real. And I was devastated.
Mm.
So I put on my phone to random music. And the song that played was In Dreams by Roy Orbison, where he talks about only seeing his lover in his dreams and weeping and weeping. And I thought, this is almost cruel. Like, it's like my phone knew what I was dreaming about, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
it just clicked. Like, everything clicked. I'm here. And what I thought was, I am going to be alone for a long time. And I'm okay with that. Which later down the line, or I don't know how much time we have, but I'd love to give you my theory of love at some point, by the way. But go on with whatever you want to
Just a
say.
small, concise theory of love. Yeah,
Oh,
well,
pretty concise, yeah.
it's. I mean, what it reminds me immediately is that we talked before about freedom in the context
Mm-hmm.
of that, and it kind of brings me to that, and also the everything is going to be fine thing. So yeah, that definitely corresponds with my dreams, because everything did turn out fine, and for you as well. And
It did.
yeah,
To
and
everybody's
so
surprise but me.
and me at this point, but it's easy for me to say now. um yeah, and about the freedom there, I'd say, now it's just me being poetic and interpreting it, but I think there is something free about drapes kind of moving, dancing in the wind, not controlled by anything. They're not um forcefully attached to a bed of any sort or something like that, and they're just doing their thing, which not necessarily is the intended use for them even, but they're just being in the wind. And yeah, how does that connect you to the whole subject of freedom and the experience of suffering tyranny in that mental hospital?
Very profoundly, because there was a moment which, when I was in Indonesia, a very mystical moment in my life. Obviously, I was in the throes of a manic episode, and therefore could be considered quite delusional at this point. But that, William James, when he wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, was told, most of these people have obvious mental health issues, and said, yeah, but does that mean that their experience is false? Does that mean that what they're experiencing doesn't relate to truth at all? At
Mm-hmm.
all? There is no correlation between whether somebody's in what is perceived as a disturbed mental state and whether what they're going through can correlate to reality. Maybe what we consider mentally disturbed has a profound truth to it. That might be the case. But anyway, I was in Indonesia, and I was in real life on a bed, and there was a man who was probably going through his own mental health issues, who somehow thought that I was right about being quite a spiritual being, and he was standing by me, and there was actual, around the bed, linens that were bellowing in the breeze. And as I
Mm-hmm.
was in the bed, I all of a sudden felt this pain overcome me physically, to a degree that I'd never felt a pain. And it felt as though, for sure, I was dying. I knew I was dying. I didn't have any doubt about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it lifted out of me, and I could feel it lift out of me like a presence coming out of my core being. And I could almost hallucinatorily see it ascend away from me. Whatever it was about me, something about me died that day, and it made me cry a deep and profound kind of why me sequence of tears. Like, why do I have to go through this pain? And then it was gone. Then it lifted right out of me. And I think that actually something about that moment was, for me, the moment I went from being a child to being a man. I've never felt the level of fear that I used to feel in my life ever since I went through that mini death within life, which is a line from Bukowski. You know, there's a death within life, and there's not much
Mm,
light, but it beats the darkness.
mm,
So I went through a death within life in a circumstance very similar to that dream. And I think there's something about liberty in the face of absolute suffering or tyranny or something like that that requires you to be able to say, I need to let myself die in order to fully
mm,
live. And
mm,
so there was that connection there for me. Because if you're unwilling to go through a death within life, whether it's a death of the ego, which can be a violent, devastating experience for many people, or a death of an emotion, or a death of the fear within you, if you're unwilling to go through a death within life, you're never going to rise out of the darkness. Because frankly, the darkness has its own comfort. At least you know it. So you have to be willing to die and let something go. And that dream that I had about a lover of mine in between the linens holding me, saying it's going to be okay, provoked a memory of that moment of mystical death in Indonesia, which ultimately shaped the rest of my life.
wow, wow, wow. Yeah, I mean, you can definitely see the thread running through it. So I myself went through a sort of death on a psychedelic experience, and I've elaborated on that on a different episode. And it's I'm just mentioning it to say that I think I've gone through something possibly similar, but an experience that's even more relatable here is that not in a dream, I was on an airplane, and
Mm-hmm.
the stewardesses were just starting to give out the meals to people, right? So they do that once they reached altitude. They're quite confident that there are no turbulences, and people could eat, and they're also
Mm-hmm.
not sitting in their seat with seatbelts on. Actually, the seatbelt sign wasn't even on, and all of a sudden, they're next to me. The plane just drops. Okay, so
Mm.
my head bangs against the ceiling of the airplane, and everybody's fucking screaming and start actually praying and saying, it was like, Shema Israel, which is this Jewish prayer of like, hear us God. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
make everything okay. um, and I look at the eyes of a girl that's across from me in the aisle, and she was probably like 14 or something. She was young, and we
Mm-hmm.
look back at one another and we catch a glimpse of each other's faces, and we're silent, but we immediately have this understanding, and we let out a smile. And
Mm.
it was just one major drop, but obviously, like, the air crew was, they were shaken as well, like, this should not happen. And all I could think in that moment is that I had a good life. I had many friends who love me. I have a family who loves me, and I love them back. And I'm totally going with this because I'm literally out of control here. It's not like I can save the day or do anything, and I'm at peace with dying right now. And
Mm-hmm.
okay, soon enough, after a minute, like, the pilot basically goes on the mic and says, like, "Whoops, we didn't see it coming." It's like the radar didn't pick
Mm-hmm.
up on these clouds or whatever. So it was a near-death experience in a sense. Well, not in a sense, because the imminent death was agreed on by everyone there. So so what if it wasn't going to happen? It is a near-death experience in perception, and I think that you can see that in my dreams too, which is, my mind did not make me not fall, or the baby not fall, or the rocket not fall. Like, it found other ways to help me come out unscathed, or other people who I love or care about. But
Mm-hmm.
acceptance can really save you in these moments, and that is freeing, that is liberating, like, not actually being afraid. If you are tense, then this affects your mood, and you're actually probably going to depart from this world in a bad state. Like, I'm not saying that I know
Yeah.
anything about an afterlife or have any sort of
Mhm.
really opinions on it. Um, but
Well,
just the
we're
way
definitely
that
going to
we
talk about that.
imagine the way we imagine the end of our lives is always is like, I wish for myself to be in a bed free of stress with loving
Hmm.
people around me, and there's a reason for that, and there's a I don't know anything about what happens after, but we all want to go in peace. And I think
Hmm.
that only if you find a place where you can be completely accepting and go in peace, then almost paradoxically, it's going to, or not paradoxically, but maybe surprisingly, it's going to make your life much better, because you know that death is imminent and it is all around you and it could jump you at any moment. So you better be in that state all the time, because you're not going to have the privilege of choosing when to be in that state.
Absolutely. So, yeah. So Sarah Coakley, who's a wonderful theologian and philosopher, says life is a meditation on death. And for the Stoics have this concept of memento mori, that we rehearse for death regularly.
Mm-hmm.
In our mind, we practice dying over and over again to allow us to live more fully. But I want to explore briefly whether or not it's rational to fear death. I don't think it is. It seems to me rather obvious that if evolution selects for what's going to maximize fitness in terms of propagation of your genes over time,
Mm-hmm.
then being fearless about death is not going to be selected for evolutionarily, because you're going to die possibly younger than you should before you have all the children that you could rear, and you'll die younger than you could to protect them or whatever. So I think fear of death is just an evolutionary instinct. To me, it's obvious that would be the case.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of evolutionary instincts, we trivialize them, but we don't do that with fear of death. Why? I think there are a few reasons. One, there's this idea, which I think we're all deep down terrified about. And Lorenzo Medici, I believe, I might have the Medici wrong, but it was a Medici. I'm pretty sure it was Lorenzo. Died in total annihilation emotionally because of this idea, which is hell. There's a part of
Mm-hmm.
us that thinks, well, maybe there's an afterlife, and in that afterlife, there could be either a heaven, eternal bliss, or a hell, eternal suffering, that awaits us. And that possibility of hell is so real to us that the way most people think of death is more like hell than it is like even people who are anti theistic, anti religious, and so forth think of death as some kind of an eternal darkness. There is no darkness, there is no light if you think that there's nothing, if it's a cessation of consciousness entirely. If you
Mm-hmm.
believe that, then there's neither darkness nor light. You're not locked in a room alone suffering, which is how a
Right.
lot of people think about the afterlife. So they imagine it to be hell. This fear of hell, I think, motivates a lot of fear of death. And then there's the evolutionary instinct, which works in collaboration with the fear of hell to sustain how uncomfortable we are talking or thinking about death. But then there's the other side of it, which is the evidence that comes from near death experiences of people who have these incredible trips they go on when their heart stops or their body is technically dead, and then they come back to their body later. And th- generally, they don't provide evidence of an afterlife, except for in one case that's really fascinating. This is a case which I learned about through a behavioral psychologist, and I looked into myself, of a guy who was in a hospital, and his nurse took the weekend off. And while he was in the hospital, he had a near death experience where supposedly in the afterlife, he saw the nurse who took the weekend off. And she said, "Tell my parents I'm sorry that I wrecked the MGB car or whatever." And also told him it's not his time and he needs to go back. And then he goes back into his body and he tells a nurse what just happened, a different nurse. And that nurse runs out of the room very upset. It was true that this other nurse died that weekend, just before he had his near death experience. And there is no immediately obvious way he could have known about that, which seems to provide evidence not of an eternal afterlife, but that there's some sort of an existence which could take place independent of bodily existence, just by way of the evidence of somebody encountering someone else who had recently died in their near death experience. So, if you want to be optimistic about what happens after death, you can find an abundance of reasons to be optimistic. If you want to be pessimistic, you can find an abundance of reasons to be pessimistic, especially neurological reasons that you manipulate the brain in a certain way through anesthesia and then you have no consciousness. What happens if you manipulated it all the way to not functioning at all? Why would you have any consciousness and so forth? You can be optimistic or pessimistic, but this irrational fear of death, I think, has more to do with hell. It's much scarier to go through your death within life, where you continue breathing afterwards, than it is
Mm-hmm.
to go through your death by way of stopping your breath entirely, to me. So I'm ready to go through
Same.
another death within life if I have to, but I certainly know how devastating that experience is because I went through it once. And I'm not at all afraid of actual death because there's a spiritual side to me, which brings me a sort of optimism, which is different from hope. Optimism is a prediction. Hope is merely an attitude that says whether or not you think things will turn out well, it's worth fighting for what you want. There's an optimism within me. But beyond that, I don't believe in hell. And I think if hell exists, if the theists are right that God exists and hell exists, the most compelling case for what hell is comes from Charles Tolliver, who says hell could be God's love, because love can be torturous or divine, depending on how you are or are not able to receive it. In other words, you're in heaven if you're feeling the full force of God's love and you think you deserve it. You're in hell if you're feeling the full force of God's love and think you don't deserve it. Nothing is worse than knowing somebody is showering you with love and feeling fundamentally like you do not deserve the love that's coming your way. Now, that version of hell, if God exists, that could exist too. But hell in terms of like demonic torturers catapulting you into flames and stuff like that, that just seems like we need to rid ourselves of this notion. Hell in terms of the traditional understanding of the afterlife as being locked in a dark room with no noise or anything else, that needs to be discarded too. We've got to acknowledge fear of death is an evolutionary impulse, and like many evolutionary impulses that serve us well to propagate our children, it doesn't necessarily serve us well on the overall emotional experience we have, and we should do what we can to overcome it.
Yeah, I really love that at this point we've come full circle to really death and rebirth, and yeah, I'm just planting this flag right now. Like we're probably not going to get to love this place, but this time, but I'm super happy to record one as early as next week about love. So keep that in mind. And then what you just said now about being showered with love and not feeling deserving, just personally thank you for that because I haven't considered that really thought or relationship or that relation to like my depressive episode, and I'm going to think a lot about that because I think there's a lot there to unpack for me, and looking back at history and all that. Yeah, with the rebirth, I completely agree. I share the sentiment with you. I think that at some point I put up a poll on Twitter asking, "Are you actually afraid of death?" Because it's kind of hard for me to imagine that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't completely understand it when people say they're afraid of dying, and people were like, "Yes, I'm afraid of death," and it's something which, quite strangely, I really don't seem. It's not easy for me at all to relate with that because,
Mm-hmm.
much like you, I feel that I am a phoenix and that it has happened once, and that the time that it happens for real, like you say, is almost uneventful. What is like what's
Yeah.
there? It's not even an interesting event because it's the end of the story. It's not the end of a chapter. You know,
Yeah, it's like Epicurus
it's
said, I don't fear death, I just don't want to be there when it happens. And he won't, and he
exactly,
wasn't.
exactly,
He
right.
won't if it's a real
Right,
thing.
it's like what am I wishing for myself? Obviously, like everybody else, I don't want it to be particularly painful. Like I'm not looking forward to it, but um the end of a book is usually, if it's a complete story, not somebody who's trying to come up with an excuse to come up with a sequel, but the end of a story is not a cliffhanger. It's actually, there's serenity there, and that's how I view it, but the
Hmm.
cliffhangers are kind of hard to tolerate, right? You have to move to the next chapter and read and see what's there. And yeah, I share the sentiment there with you completely. And yeah, I'm just really happy that this whole conversation kind of was, um, yeah, we had our guardian phoenix watching over us and kind of guiding
Hmm.
us through it, because it was by no means structured at all, and yet we ended exactly where we should have ended. So yeah, that's it. Like, I'm more than happy to hear if you have anything else in mind to send me and listeners away with.
Sure, I do. I have a closing statement then. My
Great.
closing statement is this. You know, I'll never forget when my father told me it's much better that my mother goes before I do because I can live without her and she can't live without me. I think other people's death is much scarier than our own. And the fear of dying
Hmm.
alone makes a lot more sense than the fear of dying per se. So I don't want to trivialize what people go through when they worry about their death or the death of others. I just want to acknowledge that our own death, just as it is, just as such, is mostly an irrational fear. And I want to say that, for anybody listening who might be interested in this, the point of my being here is to have a conversation. And I feel like we did that beautifully, wonderfully, magnificently, and in every way delightfully for me. But I'll just throw my pitch out there that I am a philosophy coach. I'm a struggling grad student. I love having clients. If you feel like working with me, work with me. Uh, I do something I almost never do in real life when I coach people. I listen, and it's not about my philosophy; it's about theirs. So, that's my closing sentiment. And I guess I'll say one more thing. If you are in darkness or in doubt, remember that you have an imperishable source of worth within you, that your worth is not dependent upon the judgment of others, that you can exist whether or not you are perceived as glorious and grand, and that everything that you've ever wanted in life remains a possibility so long as you are aware that nobody but you can stop you from getting it. That's my ending remark.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful, my friend. Um, yeah, since you mentioned your coaching practice, I'd love for you to also tell anyone where you can be found online.
Great. So I have a website called ChristophePerot.com. I have a Twitter at Perot_Christophe. I have Instagram CM Perot, and Perot is spelled Porot. You are welcome to pronounce it in the French or the English way. I'm a dual citizen, so my French family would be proud one way, my American the other. And I can be easily accessed online. I also have an email, cperot@gmail.com. I love hearing from people. And even if you say, well, I certainly would never pay this guy for coaching, but I would love to be in touch and write me an email, and I would love to respond and have a conversation.
Wow. Yeah, Christoph. Well, thank you so much for taking me on this amazing journey. I'm really privileged to be part of it. And if I have to say one last thing, it's really wishing for you, for me, for everyone to be well. And if you want to call it a prayer, call it a prayer. I don't care anymore. Um, yeah, man. Thank you so much. And we'll do another one very soon on love. I'm down.
Me too.